Hello everyone, we're going to start this morning's webinar on Thursday the 14th of December. My name's Emily Ogier and I'm a marine social scientist based here at IMAS Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart. And with Professor Greta Pessel and Hannah Fogarty and a great team, we've been organising this week of webinars about different aspects of the marine heatwave conditions that Tasmania is currently experiencing. So thanks for joining us today. There's a bit of information here about how we'll run the webinar and really encouraging some interaction. So if you've got questions as the webinar proceeds, please put those in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. But before we kick off to talk about this really important topic, I wanted to acknowledge that those of us joining you from IMAS and from the hosting organisation, we're located on campuses that are on the lands of the Muwinina people. And because of English colonisation, the Muwinina people are not with us today, but we want to acknowledge today's contemporary Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples and their elders past and present as the custodians and knowledge holders of the land and marine waters in which we are meeting today, and offer our respects. And I think most important to today's conversation, and the most important acknowledgement here, is about that incredible deep time knowledge and understanding of change and disruption in our Tasmanian marine environment that those communities and peoples and leaders can bring to this conversation. So today's webinar is, we're turning from a more informational focus on what is happening to a question of heatwave help. What action is happening and what else can we do? And so we've got a great range of speakers joining us today to take us through that, 4 speakers. And we'll be hearing from each of them and then open up to a big discussion at the end. So I'm going to invite our first presenter, Dr. Alyssa Marshell, to talk to us particularly about how fisheries research itself is actually responding to these heatwave conditions. Thanks very much, Alyssa.
Hi everybody, my name is Alyssa. I'm a research fellow and fishery scientist in the wild fisheries team at IMAS, in the scale fish and cephalopod team. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of our fisheries research to support preparedness for climate change. And it's actually a huge topic, and I'm going to have to go through it very quickly to get through it all in 5 minutes. But as Em said, I'll make these slides available on the CMS website, so you can go back and have a look at some of the information, and happy to answer questions afterwards. So we've heard a lot about marine heat waves this week and the impact that they have on biodiversity and habitat loss, which leads to economic loss on some really important industries like fisheries and tourism and aquaculture. And it can have really major impacts on fisheries. So we can see possible changes in recruitment, catchability, species composition, natural mortality, maturity, growth. It really can impact all parts of fisheries industry and biology and ecology. So it can affect fish distribution and behaviour. And today I'm not just talking about marine heat waves, but climate change in general as well. There's impacts on reproduction and growth. We see shifts in marine ecosystems, habitat stress, which has impacts on fisheries, and this all leads to economic impacts. So I won't go through each of these in details, but you can have a look later on. There was a severe marine heat wave in California from 2014 to 2016, and this was a really good opportunity to see what are the impacts. And it's complicated. It's species specific. There's losers and winners. There's no one-size-fits-all answer for research and management. There was some really good, interesting surprises and lessons that came from this marine heat wave, where they studied range shifts in recruitments in lots of different species in this area. And they found that even though there's positive and negative impacts, even within those, it's really complicated. There can be direct negative impacts, indirect negative impacts, and then positive impacts that can have higher and lower management challenges. So it's a really complicated list of impacts on these different species. But overall, what they saw was that if they modeled projected changes in maximum fish catch potential around the US, and what they found is that all large US marine ecosystems are going to see a decline in fisheries catches in the future. And this is especially pronounced as you get closer to the equator and the tropics. So even though there's positive and negative impacts, overall a decline in fish catches. And here in Tasmania, there's been significant changes linked to warming on the east coast. So we've seen shifts to temperate and tropical fish with stressed abalone, harmful algal blooms, more long-spine sea urchins and gloomy octopus and eastern rock lobster and giant kelp loss. So we're already seeing the impacts of this in the east coast of Tas. And I must mention that any of the slides that have a picture of Greta, it's either her work or I've also borrowed her slides. So thanks, Greta. So Fisheries research to study some of these impacts of marine heat waves and climate change. There's Fisheries research to understand the actual climate change impacts themselves. There's species vulnerability assessments, ecosystem modelling and predictive tools. There's a research into adaptive management strategies, enhancing resilience and adaptation, and then of course international collaboration and policy. So there's a lot of detail on this slide, but it's just to show that it's really complex and there's lots of different parts to studying the impacts of marine heat waves and climate change on fisheries research. So now I'm just going to go through some examples from IMAS of things that IMAS staff have been involved in fisheries research. And the first one is the development of a project by Camille and a team from IMAS and NRE, the state government, that's pending funding, but hopefully going to be funded to study the effects of this current marine heat wave over the summer of now to 2024. And what they're hoping to do is to get funding to put a whole bunch of temperature loggers out on the FADs, on lobster pots, on the Nature Conservancy's oyster reefs, restoration projects to try and study some of the impacts on the seafood industry over this coming marine heat wave. So that's one project that we have going over this summer. We're investigating sand flathead otoliths. So we conduct fishery independence surveys for sand flatheads since 2012. So we have this amazing bank of otoliths, which are the ear bones of the fish, that have a time series of biological information and events in them. So we're studying the increments in these otoliths from fish caught around the state. And what you can do is you can have a look at the impacts of hydroclimatic factors, so sea surface temperature, on the growth of these fish in really high detail. And we'll be able to look back and see what the impact was on flathead growth in the 2015 and 16 heat wave, for example. So that's another project that we have going on at IMAS. Aster and other colleagues from IMAS have investigated fish body sizes change with temperature. And again, it's not straightforward. Some fish like banded morwong tend to be smaller when it's warmer, while fish like longfin pike will be bigger when it's warmer. So it's not a one size fits all. And Greta and her team have done a lot of work on species range shifts. So this is one of the major effects of climate change, is species distribution and changes in species distribution. And in Tas, we see that there's more records of range shifting species than any other region of Australia's surrounding ocean. So we're having the biggest effect of this from around Australia. And one of the key fisheries impacts of this species on the move, or this species redistribution, is the urchin story, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, where it was first detected in 1978. And then by 2017, there was over 20 million individuals. And there's been a lot of IMAS staff and students involved in this project over the years in studying the impacts of this move on fisheries in Tasmania. Another project that was finished up last year was led by Alexia Grabalandri, and it was looking at the opportunities and impacts of range extending scalefish species. So they looked at differences in the life history, biology and distribution and possible shifts of these important scalefish species. And it was a positive outcome. So there was a lot of news when this report came out saying that fish species that are opting for this sea change are making Tasmanian fishes happy. So this was a positive outcome. Another one is the gloomy octopus story, which is being studied here at IMAS, and it's also what you could say is a positive story. So what can you do about some of these things? I'm sure most of you have heard of REDMAP. This is where marine citizen scientists can record observations of species that they've seen turning up in Tasmania, and it's been an amazing source of data to study some of these shifts. And what we see overall is that the key points are that the small changes in the physical environment lead to large biological changes, and whether that effect is negative or positive depends on the species, and that this exposure and sensitivity will really vary across life stages. So it's really complicated and complex to study these different parts of the effects of climate change and marine heat waves on fisheries. So yeah, it can lead to unpredictable fluctuations in fish populations. It can severely disrupt fisheries and affect fish populations, and it requires proactive measures. Beth Fulton and her team put together this really great handbook on the adaptation of fisheries management to climate change, which has lots of different diagrams of steps we can take to assess our fisheries and conduct risk assessments, and then how to import adaptive management. And finally, it's going to take an interdisciplinary approach to solve some of these problems and conduct some of this fisheries research. So, when we're studying, you have to know things about oceanography, population genetics, ecology, fisheries biology. So it really is going to take a team. And I think we're really lucky here in Tasmania to have all these amazing organisations working together to answer some of these questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alyssa. That was fantastic. So just reiterating that there'll be slides available from Alyssa's talk on the website. And we just really encourage you to use chats at the moment to pass on or raise up any questions that we can return to later. So now I'm going to be inviting Zoe Cozens and Jamie Graham-Blair from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre to talk to us about their work on a palawa response plan. Thanks, Zoe and Jam.
I'm Zoe Cozens. I'm the Sea Country IPA coordinator with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. So I'm here today with this amazing man.
Yeah, Jamie Graham-Blair. I'm a proud Torway and Plangamarina Puckana. My families are from Flinders Island and kind of northern Lutruwita, Tasmania. I kind of just want to echo Emily's acknowledgement and thank all the beautiful mob that have shown up onto this Zoom this morning, but also for helping our project and our programs and holding, our country and our knowledge so securely. We would like to present a little bit by starting with our a bit of a definition on what sea country is and country more broadly. To us, country is a network of relationships. Country is everything. It's very holistic and inclusive of all the little bits and pieces, right from the molecular right up to the kind of ecosystem level. It exists over really deep timescales, and we've been connected to it for, as you probably have heard, thousands and thousands of generations through massive periods of change. Country is broad and hard to categorize, and it's really hard to form clear, concise boundaries. And because of that, different families relate to it and connect to it within the palawa community in different ways. So change and threats and values are very different between different families, depending on how they connect to country and sea country as well. As we know, however, though, healthy country results in healthy community and healthy people. So that interconnectedness between health of the one versus the health of the many is really important within our cultural practices and an intrinsic part of our relationship to country. We, because of our understanding of country and the importance of caring for it, have developed with some support from different various groups to develop a IPA.
So many of you may be aware that we, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, were funded in 2022 to develop a proposed sea country IPA in Lutruwita, Tasmania. We've been consulting the community for the last 12 months on that proposal. And the map that you can see there is the current proposal of community for the sea country IPA. Over the coming months, we will be releasing our draft management plan and consulting more widely on that. Our processes involved a healthy country planning process, which involves identification of values and targets, threat assessment to consider what is impacting those threats and targets, those values and targets. And in that, the values and targets are not just natural values, if you like, but also cultural and social values. So we've identified, through our threat assessment work, the key threats that community are concerned about. Climate change is at the top of those. due to the wide range of impacts that we are starting to experience but are expecting to worsen in the coming years. Overfishing is also another concern, and that's both within this area and outside of this area, and historical and current. So there's a wide range of issues there, with community experiencing more difficulty finding cultural resources, and that really being the indicator on why people are concerned about overfishing. As well as impacts on things like krill fishing around Antarctica being a threat to Euler short-tailed shearwater. And then there's the ongoing dispossession. Generally, there's been a disempowerment of palawa knowledge and rights and responsibilities for caring for country, and of course the terrible history of genocide here in Tasmania. So really we're trying to work through that by empowering community, connecting community to country, and making sure the voices of community are informing management decisions. So yeah, that's where we're up to at the moment with our proposed IPA. Through the proposed IPA, of course, lots of yarns happen and lots of concerns get raised, not just about what we're proposing with the Sea Country IPA, but generally around Lutruwita. And so really what we've been trying to do is support community connection with Miladina Muka by encouraging those conversations and supporting them, by providing information to mob about country and what's going on with Sea Country. And building that capacity to care for Miladina Muka. We're having a really positive response from both government and the marine science sector, which we are very grateful for, in helping us develop our management plan and also our management responses. As I said, though, it's become broader than just a Sea Country IPA. Really now we're also looking at developing a palawa Sea Country strategy, and that's about how do we actually get the voices of palawa being considered properly in those decision-making frameworks.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to the actual projects that we're engaging with throughout this Sea Country project. As Zoe's just mentioned, community engagement and consultation is really our prior concern here. Looking at consulting and getting some stories documented and looking at oral mapping of not only the IPA, but Lutruwita, the island of Tasmania in general as well. Mapping the IPA, getting an understanding of what is out there at the moment, what's surviving, what's thriving, what is under stress, and comparing our observations and kind of oral anecdotal science to the Western kind of literature and data that's available. Also looking at developing and strengthening our position within the ecosystem of science and conservation and government, as well as industry, just so that we're kind of making people aware that we're present, we're here to look after our sea country on behalf of our people, as well as developing a sense of importance of the palawa voice in this space, as well as engaging with our own science and research and own management projects, such as mapping and monitoring our seagrass beds and kelp forest, the remnant stands of giant kelp that exist around the Tyree-Richa area, some of which we've partnered with IMAS to conduct some spore gathering for a bit of a contingency plan, given the predictions this summer. When it comes to marine heatwave specific preparation and adaptations, our first step in our marine heatwave response is addressing and understanding the concerns of the community, looking at the predictions. So, you've probably seen us maybe doing a bit of consulting on social media and also within the chat of these morning sessions, gathering information to then pass that back onto the community based on their concerns that they're coming to us with. Also taking a lot of time to advocate for really responsive and adaptive conservation management actions within different industries and areas, as well as advocating quite loudly for funds and engagement with industry networks and conservation networks to support our monitoring and our restoration dreams. As I mentioned, a bit of that contingency work with IMAS, looking at susceptible species and protecting them from the summer's heatwave, but also looking at monitoring during and post the marine heatwave event so that we're understanding what is being impacted and how, as well as to look at the kind of community health impacts of these changes.
So far we're hearing a lot of community concern about the marine heatwave itself, not just the climate change and how that's affecting oceanography around Lutruwita. And so really, a lot of it is around healthy sea country, healthy country, healthy people, and that, you know, we're concerned about the health of country, and this marine heat wave is just sort of another indicator of the way the world is changing, and the need for us to be able to respond to it in increasingly sophisticated and responsive ways. We're looking, you know, people are worried about the range shifts of animals. We've recently had more turtles being observed around the islands, for instance, and we're, you know, there's concern about what that will mean for seagrass beds, which would be good tucker for those turtles. There's also a need for more accessible information. There's a lot of information that scientists have. Scientists, though, tend to want to talk with a whole lot of certainty, which I totally appreciate. But really, we're in a space where we need to actually work on the expert advice. How do we actually keep palawa community safe? And when we're talking about Tairicha, there we're talking about you know, an area with a large Aboriginal population, a remote area, and a place where we've got the only Aboriginal community on Aboriginal owned land in Tasmania. And so those communities are very reliant on their sea country for sustenance, and so food security is a real issue for community, and the impact that has on both cultural resources that are food, like the abalone that we're seeing here, but also the mariner shells and other necklace making shells. And really, there's a whole lot of questions about heat tolerance, right? And I think all of us probably have these same questions about how a species is actually going to be impacted by what's happening. Are we talking about mortality? Are we talking about reproduction? Are we talking about growth? Are we talking about recruitment? It seems to be a mix of all of those things at the moment. And so I guess we're wanting to make sure community are aware of that. And the last one there is about cumulative impacts. It's about what are we collectively going to be doing to respond to the impact of the marine heat wave in the context of all the other impacts that we know are affecting our sea country. So that's the background, climate changing and the warming, but also, you know, concerns around sustainable management, basically, of fisheries resources. Thank you.
That's us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe and Jamie. That was really insightful and important to hear. I'm now going to invite Frances Seaborn from the Department of Natural Resources and Environment, Tasmania, to talk to us about their marine response plan. Thanks, Frances.
Hi, my name is Frances Seaborn. I'm a Senior Fisheries Manager in the Wild Fisheries Management Branch of Marine Resources at NRE Tas. I was tasked in mid-September to start the development of a marine heatwave response plan, and that's been quite a interesting space for me, because it's not something that we've really looked at before. And basically, we are still in the draft phase of the plan. There's been quite a lot of consultation within NRE and other government departments about what our capabilities are to respond to certain situations. And most of our focus has been on just documenting what we can do now, what we're seeing, what we can do now. So the structure of the plan is going to be, well, the plan itself is going to be a living document, number one. It's going to be something that it's going to be evolving over time as we get new information, as we understand a bit more. The plan will evolve in that space as well. Initially, it'll be 5 main components, which will be the early warning system, and that will be looking at information presented by CSIRO and BOM, documenting our existing monitoring, working with IMAS on the best way to report changes to intensity, location, and duration of the current marine heat wave, and also focusing on our comms with regards to letting people know where we're at. The next step is next section is a risk assessment. We've done an initial risk assessment to identify vulnerable species, industries, and coastal communities. This is quite a simple assessment just based on existing research that's out there, and also impacts of the last marine heatwave that we had in 2015-16. The plan is to do a more comprehensive risk assessment for the next stage, the next version of the plan. The third section is emergency response. So we do have a couple of emergency response situations, and one would be public health. and the other would be unusual mortality events. So we have two different emergency response categories, and the idea is to develop an incident response framework, a more detailed one for version 2. Section 4 will be management response. So that's looking at the species or taxa groups, the potential impacts on those groups, our existing response capability, who's going to lead the response, and the impacted stakeholders. And of course, this is going to evolve over time. And the 5th section is the communication strategy. So this is probably the key one in this version of the plan. So it's letting people know what a marine heatwave is, how to report observations, what you might see, and what you can do, basically. And we're going to have, I alluded to earlier, we're going to have a new online response form to log non-urgent observations of marine heatwave impact, which we're currently testing. We've got our fish care volunteers on the ground over the summer who will be talking to people, and we've also encouraging people when they're seeing really serious impacts, like large numbers of animals that are sick or stressed, or large fish kill events, is to report to the appropriate emergency response channels. And the next steps will be updating our marine heatwaves webpage with new information as it comes through. Obviously, we'll be encouraging reporting of potential impact of observations. There'll be emergency ones to the relevant hotline, non-urgent ones to the relevant email address or our online form. And what we plan to do with that information that comes through our online form is to view that information at the end of once the marine heatwave event is over, and just see if we can track any themes of what we need to prioritise for the next event. And it's also something that we're working with other NRE departments, so that we're all of our information is kind of pulled into one area, so we're all looking at the same stuff. We'll also be promoting any information on marine heatwaves on through our social media channels, and we're aiming to release the final initial version of the response plan by early 2024. I've still got a few steps to go through with consultation with some external stakeholders before we get to that point. So after the marine heatwave event is over, obviously we're going to look at reviewing the impact of that marine heatwave, complete our prioritisation of species after assessing the impacts, review existing monitoring programs and determine if more monitoring is required, finalise our incident response framework, and review and adapt the response plan as we need. And there's not much else I can add to that, because we're still, like I said, we're still in our draft stage of this plan.
Thank you very much, Frances. So now if I could invite Julian Harrington, the Chief Executive Officer of Seafood Industry Tasmania, to talk with us about industry-led initiatives in response to this current marine heatwave.
But I'm going to just provide a bit of a seafood perspective of the marine heatwave. We have certainly been following this emerging heatwave for some time with great interest, and although I'm not really hearing any direct reports from any of our fishers or marine farmers at this exact point in time that are concerning, we can certainly learn off the 2016 marine heatwave experience to better understand exactly what sort of impacts we may expect. Probably one of the biggest outcomes of the 2016 marine heatwave was the emergence of Pacific oyster mortality syndrome. There are still areas that are free of POMs, so one of the things we would hate to see is that to spread further during this warmer water event, and we certainly don't want to see the emergence of POMs this season because it can be quite catastrophic on industry. Some scientific publications in Nature Communications has identified some of the other seafood-related observations from the 2016 marine heatwave, and they were increased observations of dead blacklip abalone and reports of poor condition in abalone across southern Tasmania and eastern Tasmania. Warm waters in southeast Tasmania reduced the performance of the salmon aquaculture industry, which limited supply to the seafood markets. And obviously, as reported, we see the emergence of new species that are normally seen further north. What other uncertainties are there for us as we move into this marine heatwave, or concerns that we have? Obviously, Vibrio is concerning for oyster and other industries. We certainly didn't want to see the emergence of a Vibrio outbreak. There's potential for new diseases and the spread of diseases, AVG, and unknowns. Alyssa talked about the change in the timing of spawning, which may not overlap spawning closures. We might see spawning failure, which will impact on future recruitment. We may see reduced spawning biomass if there are mortalities of animals, which will impact future recruitment. We've also seen, both for the longer term changes of climate change, but also the more temporally shortened impacts of heat stresses on habitat. Things like, well, obvious things like the giant kelp, but also the warmer waters increase the potential for the long spine urchin to actually self-recruit into Tasmania. So we certainly are keeping a strong eye on both the short-term marine heatwave impacts as well as these longer-term climate change impacts for seafood. And obviously the uncertainties, I could go on all day because there are a huge number of uncertainties for seafood. One of the questions I was asked to relate to was what can be done now as part of this marine heatwave experience. Right from the start, when we first started talking about marine heatwaves, we talked about monitoring, the scientific monitoring, to help understand any impacts and to monitor stocks and the impact it may have on stocks. We've seen a significant barrier to this being dollars, research funds. I should be sitting up in what's called the SMRCA, the government grant steering committee between the government and IMAS to support research. That grant's being eroded. And it's worth highlighting that as part of the cost-cutting measures, they removed a series of temperature loggers several months before the marine heatwave was forecast. So research dollars is going to be really important. What else can be done from an industry point of view, or participation in any events around marine heatwaves? I've participated in the FRDC-driven Bureau of Meteorology CSIRO climate updates, which have been exceptionally handy to understand the dynamics of what's happening with this marine heatwave. I've participated in NRE roundtable forums that have contributed to the plan we've just heard about from Francis. There's some other things that can be done directly by industry from a seafood fishing and processing point of view. There's a lot of things industry can do to prepare. They can ensure their systems and practices are adequate to deal with an increased water temperature. The FRDC and IMAS have produced a marine heatwave critical information and response for the southern rock lobster industry best practice that focuses on things such as appropriate carrying capacity levels in live wells, on boats, water quality monitoring, temperature loggers, measuring dissolved oxygen, and installation of aeration capacity within holding facilities. Another area we can help educate and get industry prepared is around cold chains, for some fisheries, having ice on vessels to ensure the cold chain, appropriate transportation in trucks, etc. Again, it's alluded on earlier by Francis. We need industry to be aware of the increased possibility of disease, and we need industry to report any unusual mortalities or noticeable differences in the stress levels of animals. It's going to be really important to pick up any disease very, very quickly so we can constrain it as best we can. Again, we need to ensure that industry have appropriate protocols in place for the supply chain. Things like Vibrio could result in recalls, so we need to be able to enact recalls quickly and rapidly to ensure food safety isn't compromised. There's a lot of industry practices themselves around handling of animals on boats, handling of animals that are stressed, not anchoring boats in warm bays if they have live animals on board. There's things for salmon aquaculture. They could move animals or pens to cooler parts of marine leases. But there's also some on-land considerations that we've encouraged industry to consider. Things like increased chances of bushfire through this coming season on top of the marine heatwave with animals already stressed. Bushfires could cause power outages, so hatcheries and holding facilities need to consider their alternative power supplies. And I want to highlight some of the barriers to these industry actions. Dollars in particular, a lot of industry just simply don't have the dollars available right now to review their holding facilities on boats and implement some of those quite simple, fairly low cost temperature loggers, ensure their circulation is appropriate. They simply don't have those dollars at the moment because there's a whole lot of other stresses on our industry at the moment. Right now, we've got exceptionally poor markets in place. Holding facilities are full of abalone and rock lobster. Market demand is poor. There is no space for fishers to go out and land any more products, so they're being told not to go to sea. They've got repayments on interest on mortgages, on boats, on houses, normal bills with the current interest rates impacting repayment capacity. There's a marine spatial squeeze, other sectors wanting to access the marine space. I'm dealing with 2 seismic survey proposals, 2 oil drilling, prospective oil drilling proposals, and an acreage release proposal to the east and west of King Island at the moment. We've got rule and regulation barriers, changing rules, changing regulations. We've got eroding data and science in general to support decision-making, back to the funds in that SMRCA grant being eroded because the grant is not being indexed. Look, the list goes on and on and on, but I think you're getting the message here. There's a lot of concern. There's a lot of potential things that could happen for seafood over the next month or two, but we're also dealing with a hell of a lot of other stresses facing the industry.
Thank you, Julian. It's important to get that really broader, big picture too about the marine heat wave is happening in a particular set of conditions for our Tasmanian seafood industries, and it's really important to keep that in mind when we talk about what we can expect in terms of adaptive strategies. So thank you for that. I want to thank all of our speakers and just remind everyone that all the webinar recordings and materials are available on that CMS web link that we've been circulating, as well as other materials been shared. But just with our last couple of minutes, did anyone have a specific question for any of our speakers that they wanted to raise?
I'd be really interested from each of the speakers to understand the perceptions within the communities that they're dealing with around climate change and the heat wave, because, you know, like last night I was looking on Facebook, and in the recreational community, for example, there's a lot of very strong feelings that heat waves, you know, either don't exist, they aren't a big deal, it's silly to worry about them, or they're nothing to do with climate change, you know, a whole lot of that kind of information. So I was just wondering, in terms of the people that Jam, Francis, you know, Julian and Alyssa are working with, are they still seeing a lot of that, and if that's challenging?
I might jump in there really quickly. And first, the community we've spoken to, I think because we've been so aware of change coming for quite a long time, like I'm talking 3 or 4 generations of our people understanding and knowing that change is here and happening. A lot of our people, and I'm not saying they don't exist, but a lot of our people are very cognizant of climate change and these heating events. But a lot of the, you know, some of the consultation we've had have touched on other community groups out there around the islands. So some of those are where we're finding a lot of that kind of combative, it's not real kind of mentality. But to my knowledge, no, a lot of mob are pretty understanding of what's going on, generally speaking. Yeah.
But crying out for more, I think, information about what they can do, and particularly around the health impacts, that's a real concern. There seems to be quite limited biotoxin monitoring around the islands, and so that's something we're looking to improve. So it's been so helpful having these seminars, Greta, so thanks to you and Em for organising it at such short notice.
I could probably talk to feedback we've received through NRE. So when we posted on our social media about the marine heatwave event happening, there was a lot of feedback, or a lot of comments were saying, great, we're going to get good fishing this year with new species, that sort of stuff. And then there was also people denying, you know, conspiracy, it's not really, climate change is not really a thing. But social media is a little bit different to when you're talking to people face to face. So we tend to, when we have our face to face engagements, there tends to be more concern about climate change and acknowledgement of changes that we're seeing when they're out and about. So we get a couple of different views from people.
I think I made it pretty clear in my presentation that everyone's aware of the marine heatwave, but there's these other stresses and these other impacts to fishing operations and return to fishermen that are prioritising their time and energy on the marine heatwave. So until such time as they actually start seeing impacts to their operations from the marine heatwave, these other stresses will just dominate their thoughts and their actions.
I've got a reflective thought then from these presentations, that given the environment of uncertainty about the impacts, and for some people in our communities, uncertainty that this is even happening, then those processes all of you talked about of observing what happens across this heat wave, and then having a learning, reflective, iterative phase afterwards to look back at what's occurred and then share that knowledge, sounds like that's actually a really, really important adaptation strategy in itself then, to, I guess, increase our capacity and our knowledge to confront what are actually going to become more like normal conditions, is what I understand from the forecasts in the next 20 or so years. So I wonder if any of you have got any suggestions on how we can make sure we don't lose attention after the marine heat wave on that need to really learn and gain insights from what's occurred.
Yeah, look, and a lot of that is going to be down to our resourcing capabilities as well. So, and to be honest, we're still finalising the actual response plan itself. So what evolves after that is still something that we need, how that's going to look is something that we still need to discuss with stakeholders as well. So, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is about recording observations. So if we just have a database of where we're receiving people's observations out in the water, whether it's commercial fishers, general community, palawa community, whoever, if we can have a central database of what people are seeing that we can review later, I think would be a really, really important thing. And also just refining our responses, how we respond. Fisheries management is quite inflexible due to its legislation, so, and we're pretty tied to how we can respond to certain situations. So it'll be looking at, you know, different ways we can do that in the future, I guess.
I think some of the processes that are already underway are incredibly helpful and need to continue. And so I think the state government bringing people together has been, I think, really helpful to share our concerns and our questions. And really, I guess, starting to draw out where we have common needs. And I think that doing more of that will actually help address some of the misinformation that is in the community about the significance of the threat that our country is currently under with this marine heatwave, but also what that next 20 years or so looks like for sea country. And I think, really continuing to advocate collectively is where, for those types of changes, for adaptive and responsive management that really helps everyone and helps country is really what we're going for. So we're increasingly reaching out to the Commonwealth Government as well around this to make sure that really all parties are coming together and being able to, get clear information out to the community about what country is experiencing or expected to experience, and really starting to involve the broader community in what the long-term response to this new reality looks like.
Thank you. I think, and also perhaps a future action for this group and this community that's gathered around these webinars will be to re-meet again in the autumn and have some reflection on the summer that's been. I just wanted to say thank you again to everybody, very much our presenters and our participants, and the information that you've shared, our hosts, and I hope you can join us tomorrow for a really important wrap-up webinar about communicating in a context of climate distress. that Dr. Greta Pessel will be leading. So thanks again, everyone. And just a reminder that, please keep accessing the materials and communicating with each other. Thank you again.